Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Socks is asleep. Well, no, he's not. He's half asleep on my lap. This is going to be a short-ish film about reading lists. These are the books that I've listed everything I've written in just about since I think spring, summer 1990. Um, it's a long time. This book's falling to pieces. It was an incredibly cheap exercise book in the first place, and it smells ancient now. It's like it's come out of the war. Right, it begins with pages and pages of me at the beginning of 1990, trying to remember everything I'd read until that point, when I was 20. And it begins, the first thing on the list is about 150 Doctor Who books, it says, and then Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Those are the first two lines. Anyway, I filled pages with everything I could remember, all out of order. But Easter 1990 is when I started writing everything down as I read it, and it begins with a Peter Ackroyd novel, The Last Testament of Oscar Wilde. I can't remember much about that Easter break, but I do remember the two things that stood out. Uh, H.P. Lovecraft wasn't one of them, although he is there. I remember reading Diane Duane's My Enemy, My Ally, and Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. And in some ways, those things are typical me. Reading something that was from one of my courses that was obviously Jane Austen. I was doing my English degree at Lancaster. I loved Sense and Sensibility, and I also loved the Star Trek novel. When I went back to college, I this was when I think it's when they opened a Waterstones in town. The first time I'd seen Waterstones, and it was quite a glitzy place in Lancaster. It was the ground floor of a hotel, a grand Victorian hotel near the castle. And this shop had chandeliers that glowed, and huge plate glass windows, and it felt very fancy inside. They had tables spaced out in all the rooms, round tables that had loads of paperbacks lined out, lay out, and they were everything that was out that week. This is where it's different to nowadays, I think. They seem to have everything that had come out, and there was so much to choose from. And I remember my first things that I chose being on my first visit to a Waterstones. I remember choosing a collection of stories by Virginia Woolf and The Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. I think it was my birthday in November '89. It would have been. I also bought from a shop over the road a light jacket with kind of satiny collars that was dark blue, and my whole household, my whole student house, went out for a Chinese meal that night. And it was one of the first times I've been to a Chinese restaurant, and it was a proper banquet. um, Other things about that Waterstones was that I learned not long after it had opened that it had been a hotel since the 19th century, and that one of the ghost stories written by Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins together had been written in a room upstairs, directly above the fiction department of Waterstones. And I don't know which short story. I must find out, and I must find out if it's true. That's the legend, anyway. So it was quite a kind of spectacular place in some ways. There was a wine bar at the back of it in the basement that was it had a kind of a gay night every week or something, and it was the first time I'd been to a gay bar as well. And I saw my Shakespeare tutor there. I remember it was packed out. It was absolutely heaving with all the gays of Lancaster. This is about 1990 as well, I suppose. So this whole building was incredible, really. Anyway, so that's where I was going, and just down the street from there, oh, was what W.H. Smith's and the library, both places that I scored books in these kind of very early days of the 1990s when I was a student. Smith's had a very small selected fiction section, and that's where that term that I came back after Easter, I was buying Christopher Isherwood and J.D. Salinger and reading them for the first time. Um, Waterstones was for brand new things, not the kind of older things like that. I remember buying Christopher Hope, a novel called My Chocolate Redeemer, at that point. Um, and Almasted Maupin, Tales of the City came from there. And Tyler, I remember, oh, it was that term, that summer term, having my first boyfriend who was American, and he knew about contemporary American fiction. So the first time we went to Waterstones together, he bought the new Ann Tyler, which then was Breathing Lessons, and The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. And those were big reads of that summer. So, I mean, obviously, it's just lists in this kind of very tidy handwriting with little pink or red blotches next to the books I particularly liked. And it goes on. It's a diary, really, although there's nothing more than just the titles and authors. But I can see pictures for all of these pictures of not just the books in question and what happens in them, but where I was when I read them. Um, 1991 was a particularly good year. There was lots of stuff out that I just loved, and I hit lots of books that became very important to me, one after the next. So, a year on from what I've just described, in spring 1991, I'm reading people like Angela Carter for the first time, and going straight from Nights at the Circus to The Bloody Chamber. And what else am I discovering at that point? Truman Capote, actually, and back to John Irving, and the first time I read The Hotel New Hampshire, and carry on reading the Armistead Maupin series. This is when I'm coming to the end of my undergraduate degree, and I read Jeanette Winterson for the first time. All of Jeanette Winterson. Anyway, on it goes through the 90s, through to the point when I do my PhD, and there's lots and lots of kind of theory and literary theory and gender theory and all this stuff, and magical realism theory and surrealism, but reading fiction the whole time. And I think when I did averages, eventually, when I looked at the kind of the numbers, I was reading about 120 to 140 books a year. But I've always seen it as my job. This is what I do. To write at all. That's just the very, very tip of the iceberg of what people see of what you do. The rest of it is all the reading, all the thinking, all the scribbling that you do, and that's massively underground, underwater, hidden. And that's what you see in things like this. All the stuff that gets ground up and composted into me. 2000 suddenly I'm on here. I've skipped ahead. That's 10 years worth just there. Half of this book. The year 2000 began with The Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald, who at that point was my colleague at UEA. He taught a term with me on the MA. Chocolat came out, Joanne Harris, and I read that. My iPad is talking to me. um, I could get lost in all of these. It's funny, I've just read a mention of Adriana Trigani and Big Stone Gap, that series of 4 books she did in about 2001 to 2004 or so, and I read them as they came out. about a mobile librarian living in the Appalachian Mountains. I love that series, and they're all here on the shelves, all split up. But I'd forgotten about it. And when I read in Dear Fahrenheit 451, there's a section about Annie Spencer's love for those books. How, as a librarian, she'd suggested them to people, but had never read them herself. And I thought, I've read them, I love them, and I've forgotten about them. And all these things are just tucked away, like this postcard is tucked away inside of here. There to be rediscovered again it's the reason for having the books still on your shelves and uh, not culling them, as people say. And I'm looking up there at that shelf, the shelves I can't quite get to because of the boxes of drawings and manuscripts. But I'm looking at Andrew Holleran's Dancer from the Dance. Oh God, a thriller called Through the Walls, which I loved when I was judging a prize a couple of years ago. Hewitt Selby Jr.'s Last Exit to Brooklyn, Train Spotting, Irving Welsh, Brian Jacks' Redwall, um, the Susan Sontag reader, and Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. Nothing connecting those apart from the fact that I've read them at some point in the last 30 years. And maybe I'll read them again. I don't know. Actually, what does connect them is a certain kind of dense writing. When I think about Holleran and Selby Jr. and Irvin Welsh, there's a kind of a lyricism, but a dirty realism as well that captures a certain time and a certain place. So you could put those books together very nicely and argue a case that they belong together. Um, and those elements are the things that would take me back to reread them. But I heard somebody saying on some uh, YouTube channel that uh, about not keeping books. Not keeping books as kind of trophies on your shelves when you've read them, and I can kind of see that. Just keep the ones that really mean something. But at the same time, how do we know what means something? We don't know that sometimes for years and years. At the time I read Big Stone Gap, it was enjoyable and I loved them, and I read each one for 4 years as they went along, and they seemed as if they were going to be important. Then I forgot about them. And now it's only now 20 years later that I want to reread them. Well, at some point I could have just thought, oh, they're just light romances, and chuck them, and that would be a shame. So maybe I'm arguing that I'm doing the right thing in cramming my shelves as much as I have. I don't know. I'm still thinking about it. I'm still thinking about having some kind of system for maybe making some space. There are a number of things, a number of books that I've bought this year that are going to make their way to a charity shop. There's at least 4 or 5 down there. I've started making a pile on the floor, things that will not darken my door again. um, this particular book, this black and red one, it began in 1990, uh, goes until, let me see, 2006, a year that begins with At Bertram's Hotel by Agatha Christie and Dangerous Lady by Martina Cole and Making Your Mind Up by Jill Mansell. That's 2006. The best bits in these are the Christmas bits. Halloween sometimes is good because you can see the things that I return to read at Halloween. The list of things at Christmas is always interesting as I make myself feel Christmassy. It's a long run up to Christmas, and I start reading snowy, mysterious, spooky books in about early November. And eventually I get to kind of full blown Christmas, which in 2007, for example, involved The Starlight Barking by Dodie Smith, Edith Nesbit's The Story of the Amulet, The Wandering Wombles by Elizabeth Beresford. It was kids' books this year, you can see. Carrie's War by Nina Borden, lots of nostalgia. Steps Out of Time by Eric Houghton, Dark is Rising, Susan Cooper, Hercule Poirot's Christmas by Agatha Christie. That was a good Christmas reading. I think it goes on 2010 um, up to 2013, this particular book. So it's 23 years worth of reading. The last thing in it is Christmas 2013, of course. And I was reading all the Doctor Who annuals for the book I was about to write about them. And I read an anthology called Round the Christmas Fire, published by Vintage that year. And I'd bought it from the Whitby bookshop. And a whole bunch of us went on a kind of writing retreat that Christmas, well, December-ish, early December. And it was when there was floods in Whitby and all the electricity went down in the shops on the uh, by the harbour. And every shop was lit by candlelight. So it was like stepping back in time. And the bookshop glowed with candles set on saucers. And I bought this Christmas anthology and it was magical. So that's how that finishes. And then I had to buy a new book to start listing them. Um, and that was the beginning of 2014, which begins with reading this biography of J.D. Salinger that Jeremy had got me for Christmas. That was the one. It's almost it's 10 years ago. The biography that came out saying that there was about to be a whole set of releases of lost books or hidden books by Salinger. His whole kind of oeuvre that he'd never released. It never came to be, at least not yet. Anyway, so it begins in 2014 and covers the last, whatever that is, last 10 years. Sometimes when you think you've not had a decent year of reading, you can confound that by looking back through. And it's interesting how many red dots actually make it uh, onto the page. Some things you regret dotting afterwards. 2016, for example, was the year that I decided was going to be the year of beach house books. Because we've got a beach house, it's kind of a bit dilapidated now, and it was filled with bookshelves, and it was like a little living room at the bottom of the garden. But there were so many books that I owned, mostly secondhand, mostly picked up over the years, boxes and boxes, shelves and shelves that I hadn't read yet. And so it was a kind of what they call now a book buying ban that I put myself on, and I was only going to read stuff that I'd stockpiled. And so 2016 began marvelously with things like Star Wars Shadow of the Empire by Steve Perry, Italo Calvino's Adam One Afternoon, and A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. All of these things, of course, became instant favourites, and there's red dots all down the page. There were some rotten things as well that I wish I hadn't read, but uh, it made me read Ed McBain, and it made me read what else for the first time? I went back and read a Philip Ridley novel called In the Eyes of Mr. Fury, which I'd bought as a student because it had a beautiful cover, and I liked his kids' books, but I'd never read it. I just got used to seeing it on the shelf. So it was a good kind of stock taking exercise, and it went on for months and months, and I didn't buy anything new, I don't think, apart from obviously from things that I'd had on pre-order. Anyway, soon back into my bad habits, and I was buying brand new books and taking risks on them. Although that meant I got things like The Reader on the 627 by Jean-Paul Didier Laurent, which was a really lovely book, as I remember. I don't remember much about it. I just remember enjoying it and giving it a firm red dot on this page. Honey and Dust by Piers Moore Eade. There's a book about people who look after bees and people who chase honey around the world, who taste honey all over the place, cities and deserts. It's a book about honey, and it was fantastic. And I read it because I had a conversation with the author in the book tent, the author's tent at the Edinburgh Book Festival that year. And he was really friendly. He just sat down and asked me what I was doing there, talking about what he was doing there. And he was just really nice in a year in which, I have to tell you, not many people in the author's yurt were. They were a snobby lot that year. And that was the one where some of the younger volunteers were very snotty indeed that year. And I sat there, I just arrived, and I heard a bunch of them stood around the drinks counter saying, "Oh, come away, come out for dinner." And this woman saying, "I can't, I have to introduce somebody's reading. Oh, someone you'd never heard of. No one you need know." And then I just thought, oh no, it's going to be me, isn't it? And it was. And when she turned up for my reading, she had clocked that it was me that had overheard her before, and she showed no shame. Oh, it was awful. Anyway, Honey and Dust was the best thing that came out of that, reading this lovely book about bees. And that's, I'm saying again, aren't I? The best things are when you make that connection with someone, with a writer who turns out to be human, thank God, and their book turns out to be good. And the kind of fleeting visit you have with each other in real life leads to you reading a book that will stay with you for the rest of your life. That's what it's about. Not people being snotty or thinking that being involved in the world of books confers upon them some kind of specialness, um, without trying. That's to be avoided, I think. Just Me by Sheila Hancock. There's the summer of 2017. Now, there's a fantastic book about her branching out into traveling the world alone after she was widowed and visiting these museums and things. A really, really good travel book. I realize looking back how much nonfiction I read and enjoy. Anyway, I'm over time already. Those are my reading. They're not journals, they're just lists. And I guess it's a very papery version of Goodreads, which I could never get along with really. But I do like keeping my lists. Right, I'm going to say goodbye, and Socks says goodbye as well. It's a bit drowsy still. And I'll see you again soon in the next episode of this. Okay, goodbye.